Hey, it's good to have you back. The second episode of our Pimcore video blog is all about the different ways to start imports. First, we will have a look at the manual options via the Pimcore backend and by right-clicking on the target folder. Then, we take a look at the possibility to do this via command line interface and REST API. Next, we will take a look at the automatic import when changing data sources and dependent imports and round off today's tutorial with an outlook on the topic of archiving folders. We hope you can take something with you while watching.
So welcome to our second session of the Data Director workshops. In the last session I presented some ways to set up imports with the Data Director. And on this session, I'd like to show you several ways of starting those imports with the Data Director. In detail, I will show you how to start imports manually, like in the Pimcore backend, with those buttons, which we have seen already in the first session. Then there will be another option to start imports via right-clicking the import resource folder or files in the assets section of Pimcore, or you can press the target folders in the data objects section and start the data port imports from there. Then there's the option to start imports via the command line interface. So when you log in via SSH to your server, then you can start the imports from there. Then the Data Director provides a REST API, which can be used to start imports. After that, I will show you how to automatically call start imports when the import source changes. So that means when the import resource is a folder, for example, and you upload a new folder to that you upload a new file to that folder, then the data port which uses this folder as the import resource, which will automatically get started. And the last way to start imports or dependent imports, this means that you have one import which gets executed, and when this finishes, automatically another import will get started with the same import file. And at last, I'd like to show you the archive folder, which will contain all the files which we used for imports, so that you can later on see if perhaps there was an error in the import files or whatever happened with the data port import data. So at first, I'd like to show you how to start imports from the Pimcore backend. To do that, I've set up 3 data ports again. This is essentially the same as we did in the last session. We want to import categories, manufacturers, and products. And for that, I've set up an XML file, which looks like that. We have some products, and those have an article number, a name, a manufacturer, and a category. So again, we want to create product objects with the article 1, 2, 3, 4, with the name. And from the last 2 items, we want to create manufacturer objects of this manufacturer tag, and afterwards assign the created manufacturers to the products. And from the category, we want to create category objects and assign those categories to our products. I've prepared those data ports, so let's look at those. I'd like to start with the manufacturers import. As said, the source data type is XML, and we want to create manufacturer objects. So in this case, core shop manufacturer objects is the class to be used. Core shop manufacturer is the class to be used. As the import resource, there is this import folder, and this refers to the asset folder in our Pimcore. Again, I've said that in the last session, we could also use a file path folder here or a URL. You see it here in the description. You can you can use one of those options. In this case, it's this folder. Then we've set up the target folder. In this case, it's just the manufacturers. This doesn't exist yet, but it will automatically be created. And when we look at the XML file, then we have to say the data director how it can find the single items to be imported. And in this case, it's obvious, it's those product blocks which contains all the data. For this reason, we list product here as our XPath expression for an item, and as the raw data fields, we will use manufacturer, that's this one and this one. I've skipped the archive folder because we will go into detail about that later on. Then when we look at the attribute mapping, that's really the same as in the first session. We have the object key set to the manufacturer name, and also the name field also set to the manufacturer name. And in this case, the manufacturer name will also be the key attribute, which will be used to find already existing items when you do imports multiple times. Yes. To start this import manually, we can go to the history and manual import buttons, import panel, and there we see 3 buttons. The first is the raw data import. This one extracts the raw data, which we've set up here, the raw data fields, from our import file. So in this case, it would extract the manufacturer from there and write it to an intermediate table. And the data from this intermediate table can be used to start the PIM import. And this PIM import will create the data objects, or will edit existing object if it finds those. This one will edit the Pimcore data objects. And it will do so via these attribute mapping we've set up. Now let's start with the raw data import. We just press that button. We could upload a file here, but as we use the default import resource, our asset folder, we do not have to set up anything here, so we can just start the raw data import. When we do that, we see that the raw data import got started and 2 items have been imported. We can see those items in the preview panel. What we see here is this intermediate table. There we'll see all raw data fields and which data got extracted from our import resource. Now we see there's our manufacturers, Jumpy and Lime, and this comes from our import XML file. When we want to create data objects from this intermediate table, then we can use the second button. That's the Start PIM Import button. When we press this one, then in the background, the import will get started. After some seconds, we see that the PIM import started. It finished successfully, and 2 objects got created. When we refresh the data objects tree, then we'll see that the manufacturers folder got automatically created, and below that we see our manufacturer objects. And again, to the third button, I already mentioned that in the first session, but again, this Start Complete Import button does the same as these 2 buttons together. At first, a raw data import will be done, and afterwards the data from this raw data import will get used for the PIM import to the Pimcore data objects. Just to show you that, I will delete those manufacturers again. And start the complete import. again the default import resource gets used, which is the file from our assets folder. Then we see quite the same data. We see that the raw data import got started, and afterwards the PIM import got started. And when we refresh the data objects tree, then we'll see that the manufacturer folders is there, and below that the manufacturer objects. So until here we've all seen this in the first session, but now I'd like to tell you something new about the other ways how you can start imports. At first, there's this item. We can right-click the target folder where the imports of the data port shall be created in, and when we right-click that item in the data objects tree, then we can start imports also from there. Let's do that with the categories here, and when we look that the target folder is the products, so let me just create this one. When we right-click this products folder, in the background, a request is sent to the server, which fetches the data ports whose target folder is this products folder. And when it finds some, then this import menu item gets added. Now, for our data ports, only the categories and products will go into this target folder, so you can start the categories import right from the menu item here. When we press that, in the background again the import will get started, and when we look at the history and manual import panel, then we'll see that a complete import got started, and after that finished, the data objects tree got refreshed, and we see that the category objects got created. There is another way to start the import from the Pimcore backend. It's not via the target folder, but via the source folder. So let me just delete those categories again. And when we look at the category settings, the XML resource is the import folder. When we go to that folder in the assets tree, you can also right-click that. And from there, the same happens in the background. The data director fetches those data ports which can be started based on this folder. In this case, all 3 of our data ports are based on this folder. And so we can also start the import from here. Again, we start that. Look at our history panel. There we see those raw data and PIM. And when we refresh our data objects tree, then we will see that the products folder get created, and below that we have our category objects. So we can start imports via the context menu of the target or the source data, source files within Pimcore backend. The third way to start imports is via the command line interface. For that, normally you would log in via SSH to your server, and from there you can execute commands to start the imports. As I use the Docker demo, which ships with the bundle, so you can, when you buy the bundle, then you have also access to this Docker demo, so you can try out some features without actually editing anything in your Pimcore instance. So as I use this Docker demo, we have to use a special syntax for logging in to our server. And this command looks like that. When we open the terminal and execute this, then we see that we're now logged in our container. When I show you the files, then this looks like a typical file structure of a Pimcore project. And from there we can execute in console to list all those commands which are available in our Pimcore the demo system. The most important commands for our workshop here is under the data director namespace. We will use in this workshop the extract command. This is the command which we started when we did the raw data import. So we can also do that via the command line interface. The second command we will use is the process command. This one imports the data from this intermediate table which the extract command populated, and takes those data and creates or edits the data objects with this data. And the third command we will use is the complete command. This again is a shortcut for first extracting the data from the import resource and afterwards processing those data. So at first, let's look at the extract command and which arguments this can handle. We'll see here that the first command has to be the data port ID. We can see this in the data objects data ports tree. There we see 1, 2, 3, and when we want to do the import with the categories, we will use the ID 1 in this case. As a second parameter, we can provide a file name to be used. If we do not provide a file name, then the default import resource which we have configured here in the data port settings will get used, and we'll do that for this demo. So we will not provide any file name. Then there are some options. I will go into detail about some of them in a minute. So that we can see something, we'll use the -vv, which means very verbose. We see that in the bottom here. Okay, now when we execute this command, then we'll see the raw data import gets started for data port 1. It uses the default source as the import resource, and it will use the products1 XML file for extracting the data from that. And from this file, it found 2 raw data items. Now again, when we look to the preview panel, then we see 4 items this time. This one and this one are the ones from the CLI import, from the command line import we just did, and this one from up here are the ones from the assets import when we right-clicked the asset source folder. Again, to clarify, I'll delete the raw data so that we can be sure that only the data from our CLI import gets used. And there we see it, default source, and it imported dirt bikes and trading bikes. And when we look at the products XML file again, then this is just what we expected for the categories import. This one and this one. Now, for the second step of import, that's the processing of the raw data, of the raw items, we have to use the command data director process. Again, we will look at the arguments of this command. This does handle the data port, so we have to provide the data port ID again, which will be 1, and we can provide a raw item ID. When we look at the preview again, there we see the raw data ID is 12 in this case for the dirt bikes category, and when we use that, then only the data of this single raw item will be imported to the Pimcore data objects. And when we execute this, then we'll see it just uses raw item 12, and it imports data to products dirt bikes. Now when we look at that, of course in this case it already existed. For this reason it didn't save the object to save time or to increase performance. But let's just delete this, that we see that it really imports the data from this one raw data item. We execute it again. Then we see that it does not find any item with this set key fields. For this reason, it imports a new object, or it creates a new object and saves that object to the path products dirt bikes. Now when we refresh the data objects tree, then we'll see that there's this products and below that only the dirt bikes objects, and that's because we only imported the raw item 12. When we now execute the import without this raw item ID, this means all raw items from this data pod shall be imported. Now when we execute this, then we see it first tries to import raw item 12 and afterwards raw item 11. We see that for the first item it does nothing. I will come to that in a second. And for the second raw item, it saves the category object under products tracking bikes. So when we refresh the products folder, then we see that also the tracking bikes category got created. Now to what happened here with the skipping. The log says that it skipped the object because the found object had a property import hash _1, which matches the hash of the raw data values. So that means for all raw data fields of this data port, and for each raw item, a hash gets created. And this hash will be written to an object property after the import is done. And the reason for that is that after you import some data to data objects and an editor comes and changes data, then you would sometimes not want to override that manually changed data. So when we, in this case, for example, changed the name of the dirt bikes category to dirt bikes new, and we save this object, then the hash will of course stay the same. And when we now re-import the data from our XML file, the manually edited changes will not be overwritten. There are some cases where this is wanted, but in a lot of cases it is not. Normally you would define that the field has one single source of truth, and if this is not within Pimcore but in another system, then I would recommend to set those fields to read-only fields. But if those are not set to read-only fields, then there is the chance that someone will edit this field after an import happen. And when then the import will be done again, no data will be overwritten. So that's kind of a security feature. But then when there is a new import file where the name has been changed, then of course the hash for all those raw data fields will change, and then the import of course will override this field. So that's how this hashing, raw data hashing will works. Now then we have the third command which I mentioned, that's the complete command. Again, this does the same as the extract command and the process command, but in one step. For this reason, it has the parameters or the arguments of both commands, with some exceptions, but you have to provide the data port and the file name to be used, and then everything is pretty much the same as starting the extract command and afterwards the process command. Now when we do that again for the categories, let me just delete those again. and start it with data part 1. Then we'll see that at first the raw data import gets started with the data from the products 1 XML. It imports 2 raw data items and then imports those 2 to the Pimcore data objects. Then when we refresh the data objects tree, again there's our products folder, and below that the category objects. Right. That's how the command line interface works. For our, there's one more thing about the command line interface. I'd like to show you that with the products. The products has the data port ID 3, and again I will use the extract command and use -b for very verbose. Again, it imports those 2 raw data items. That's the same as before. When we look at the preview, then we see our data. Now we have the point that another import file gets added in the meantime. So imagine when you have an ERP system or another source system where the data gets exported from to your Pimcore, then it could be that in the ERP system, with every change of the data in this system, an export file gets created and uploaded to your Pimcore server. And for this reason, there could be multiple import files at the same time, and those should be processed one after the other. When we execute the extract command the way we did before, we will see that only one file will get executed, and namely this one, which has the oldest modification date. So when there are multiple files in the import resource folder, the data gets sorted by the modification date of the files. When we look at those files, then we'll see that the products 2 got last modified on 11/28, and the products 1 XML got modified on 11/48. And it's really important to use the order that the import uses the correct order, because when data of the same object changed multiple times in different files, then we have, of course, to import the latest data or the latest file at last, because otherwise the data would be corrupted afterwards. Now for the reason why it imported only one file, the reason for that is that we have to use another option to import all raw data, and that's this RM flag. This RM flag, as stated here, this removes the used import files after the extraction or after the raw data import. And when we do that, we'll see that it will use the data from both files, products 1 and products 2, and it all imported 4 raw data items. Now when we look at the raw data items which got imported, then we'll see that there is data from the same object or from the same product. It has been changed in multiple files. And we see here that's for the product with the article number 1235. And in the first file, it got named Dirtflyer 2020, and in the second file, it got renamed to Dirtflyer. And as we saw in our, they already got archived, we see it here. The data from the products 2 XML had the last modification time 11/28, and this is also used as the last modified time. Of course, it's displayed here in the local time zone, but it's the data above here. This is the data from products 2 XML, so this one gets imported first, and afterwards the data from the products 1 XML file got imported, and for this reason the data gets listed last. All the raw data gets sorted at first by the modification date and afterwards by the raw data fields. And this guarantees that the raw data gets imported in the same order as the files in the import resource folder. Now when we import those data with the process command, then we will see that at first the name got set to Jumpy Dirt Flyer 2020. This is from the first item. And later on it got changed to the name Dirt Flyer. When we now refresh our data objects tree, or our products folder, under the dirt bikes category, then we'll see that at the end the object will be named Dirt Flyer. And this is correct because the last import file to be used had the name Dirt Flyer in it. So that's the name which should stay at last. But when we import multiple files from the folder and use the RM flag, then of course afterwards the data will be deleted. And for this reason, when you do automatic imports, for example via cronjobs, you always have to use the RM flag or its alias named clear file after imports. It's an alias for the RM. You always have to use this option when you do imports via cronjob, because otherwise you would all the time import the same file, or you would of course care yourself about the deletion of the import file. Right. So then I'd like to show you something you shouldn't stumble about. When we have multiple files, let me just upload them again. And import those again. Then we'll see in this case that only products 1 got imported. And the reason for that is that the products 2 XML files last modification time is younger than 10 seconds ago. We have introduced this limit to not import only partly uploaded files. So when you imagine a file gets uploaded via FTP, you do not want to import the file when it is not completely uploaded. So for this reason, we only import data from files whose last modification time is at least 10 seconds ago. Now when we do the import again with the -rm, then you'll see that both XML files are imported again. That's about the command line interface. Then I'd like to continue with the REST API. To use the REST API, you have to enable it first in the Pimcore system settings. When you go there under the Webservice API, there's this little checkbox. Currently it says that this Webservice API is deprecated and will be removed in Pimcore 7, but we will care for that in the data director. Then we will not use the Pimcore REST API anymore, but introduce our own in the controllers ourselves. So do not be afraid of using the REST API of the data director. It will also be available in future versions. Now when we save that, the web service API is enabled. Another thing which we will have to do is to create a web service key for our user. Let's wait till this is finished. When we go to our user, in this case we only have one, which is the admin user, then we will have to set up an API key for that user. We just press this lightning button and save. And now the REST API is activated. The data director plugin has an API endpoint for every data port you create. And you can see those REST API endpoints with the button at the bottom here, REST API documentation. When you click that, you get an overview of all those REST API endpoints. So all these endpoints have the same prefix, web service, Blackbit, data director, REST import. Later on for exports, the URL will have export instead of import, but for now we only handle imports. And after that, there's the name of the data ports. So this is this name. When you change the name of data port, you do not need to be afraid that the API will not be working anymore, because in the background we will create redirects for that. So when you would rename the categories data port, for example, to category, then the API endpoints for import/categories will still work because we implement in the background a redirect. Yes, then I'd like to show you how to do imports or how to execute imports via the REST API. We can do that in this REST API documentation panel by clicking the REST API endpoint we want to use. When we do that, then we see the parameters of the endpoint. And this endpoint has only one parameter, that's the API key. For this parameter, I'd have to say that as long as we are logged into Pimcore, we do not have to use this API key parameter, because as long as the session is logged into Pimcore, we do not have to use that. But of course, we can. In this case, it's pre-filled with the API key we just generated for our user. I mean, look again here, E4BAF. That's the same as listed here. Now, when we want to try that endpoint, we can simply press the try it out button. And then, forgot to mention, in the request body for this REST API endpoint, we can provide the document to be imported. And this means that we can send here the document, and as before, we have to provide XML data, because our data port is for XML data. So now we will use those data, but change it a bit. And for our article with the article number 1234, we now use a new name, Handlebike 2020, for example, and execute this REST API endpoint. Then it's loading, and at the bottom here there's the response code 200, which means okay, so the import runs successfully. There isn't any response document. I will tell you about something about response documents later in another session. When we refresh our products folder, then we will see on the tracking bikes that there is this rental bike 2020, which we just imported with our REST call, REST API call. There's the name of the product. And it's the same as we send to our API endpoint. Another thing which gets output here is the curl command. When you imagine that there is a source system which contains data which we want to import into Pimcore, then this REST API interface can be used for live imports. So as soon as the, for example, ERP system saves an object, the ERP system could call this REST API endpoint, for example, with a curl command, and then the data from the ERP system would get loaded into the Pimcore. This can be used for live interfaces because, in contrast to uploading a file from the ERP system and then afterwards having a cron job which fetches the file and imports this into Pimcore, this has always the delay between the time of the uploading the file to the Pimcore system and the time the cron job gets executed. With the REST API, there isn't any delay. As soon as the data gets saved in the ERP system, and then the curl command would get called, then the data would immediately get written into Pimcore, so there isn't any delay between the source system and the Pimcore. So that's quite nice about those REST API endpoints. Or let me just show you when I delete this object again. Now imagine my system is the ERP system, and when we execute this curl command, then we would see that afterwards the object got created again. So this can be used for live interfaces. The API key is necessary to authenticate when we haven't any Pimcore session being logged in. I'd like to show you that with another service, and let me just copy the URL below here. I just use another tool here. This is essentially the same as we did with curl, but with a nice user interface. Let me just use this URL. And when let me just delete this again. Okay. We now log out here. And execute the, I forgot the request body. And go back 2021 for instance. And when we execute this without the API key, then we'll get as a response the 403 forbidden, so we are not allowed to access this API key. And when we again use the API key and send the same request again, then we'll see that we get the 200 OK. And when we log into the Pimcore again, of course, in real systems, it will be much faster than on this Docker demo. My notebook isn't powerful enough to have the same speed as your servers, of course. But when we look at the products folder, under the tracking bikes category, then we'll see the Lime Rental Bike 2021, which we just send to the REST API. Another thing which you can use the REST API for is that you can generate code from that. When you look at this overview of the REST API endpoints, there's this little link above here, at the top here, and what you see here is essentially a fully generated page. This is why there is this Swagger icon. Swagger is a tool which generates an HTML file or an HTML overview of your API definition. And as this API definition, it uses the OpenAPI standard. And the data director creates this OpenAPI definition file for you on the fly. And it does so behind that link. You can access this API definition under this link. When you open this, you see that's a YAML file with all those API endpoints, for example, with categories. You can use this file to generate code for your applications. This becomes really essential when you have exports, when you have, for example, a headless application which wants to use data from the Pimcore, then you could use the data director export feature and access the REST API endpoints via generated code. And for that, you can use, let me check that, OpenAPI code generator. For example, you can use this library, OpenAPI tools, OpenAPI generator, and this library uses the OpenAPI definition, and you can create code in all those languages so that you would not have to do the REST requests yourself, for example, via curl, but you could just use normal PHP code or JavaScript code or whatever your application is written in. You could just use this code, and this code will, this generated code will then do the actually REST endpoint calling. So that's another nice feature about the REST API. So as the next way of starting imports, I'd like to tell you something about this point. You can start imports automatically when the import source changes. And this means as soon as you upload a file or change a file inside this configured import resource folder, the import will automatically be started. So we'll do that for the categories data port. As we already know, it uses the import folder as the import resource, and to automatically start this import when the data inside that folder changes, we have to just check this checkbox, run automatically on new data. And we save that, and let me just remove our already imported data. And now upload a new file to that folder. Then we'll see, not yet in there, but in the background, the new import will get started. This is the current time. And in the background, a new import got started based on the changed XML file. Of course, this can also be used for all other source data types, not only XML. The same is the case when we change, or let me just show what happened in the data objects tree. Of course, there's again our products folder, and below that our categories. There they are. The same happens when we edit the file. As soon as we save this file, let's look again at the categories data port. Let's wait a second. And there's a new raw data import. And there's the new object import. We see that only one item got imported, and now we should have a new category here. There it is. So that's another way of starting imports. You could use this feature, for example, to automatically start imports when you say to your customers that they should just load their files to a certain folder, and then from that everything will be done automatically. So the customer only has to remember, as soon as I upload a file to a certain folder, then the uploaded file will automatically get imported, and he doesn't need to care about how to start imports or anything more complicated stuff. And then there's a last way of starting imports, and that's dependent imports. Again, I'd like to show you that for the categories, and afterwards the products should be imported. You could imagine, as we wanted our product hierarchy to be, or our object hierarchy to be the products folder, then below that the categories, and below the categories there should be the products. Now, when we would not execute the categories import before the products import, then this object hierarchy would not work. So let me just show that. And we now execute the products import. When we first execute our products import, then we would have the product directly under the products. And when we now would afterwards execute the categories import, and refresh this folder again, then we'll see that the object structure would not work. So now they are siblings, although the product actually is defined to be listed under its category. So for this reason, we can set up a pipeline of imports. So as soon as one import gets started, when this one finishes, then another import gets started with the same import file. So let me just delete those data again. And set up the categories import to be executed before the product import. We can do that in the attribute mapping. So I'm on the categories data port now, and there we can use this result callback function. A result callback function is a field, or is a function which gets executed after a single raw data item gets executed. You can use that for several use cases, especially later on for exports, but now we'll use the same result callback function to set up dependent imports. For setting up dependent imports, we provide, or the data director bundle provides a preset template. When you select that, then the callback function is automatically created. Now what you see here is that there are some placeholders inside this PHP code. It's dependent data port and dependent data port import resource. Those placeholders will create so-called virtual fields in the attribute mapping. So when we save that and refresh the attribute mapping, then you'll see that there are two new fields. And those are virtual fields, which means that when you assign any data, this will not get used for importing data to the data objects, but this data does only get used for, in this case, for the result callback function. So for this reason, they are all also printed in italics so that you do not get confused that these were real object fields. But we can use those fields to set up our import pipeline. We are at the categories import with ID 1, and we want to afterwards execute data port 3. So our dependent data port is 3. We just entered it here, and it just gets used there. And as the import resource, we have to get the file which got used for our categories import. And for that, we'll need to define a second raw data field. We will use as XPath expression this underscore source. That's a special identifier that we want to, or that is always filled with the current file path of the import file. So for example, when we upload a file manually, this would contain the manually uploaded file. If we would do the import with the default import source from this folder, then this underscore source will contain the file name of the file inside that folder. So we can use that to start our dependent import with the same import file as our categories import. And we can now use this raw data field to set up our second virtual field dependent data port import resource. We can just select import file here, and here we also see it that the correct file gets used there. And now we are completely done. And when we start that import, for example, via the command line interface, so now we do the complete import for data port 1, which is the categories import. We'll see that automatically also data port 3 gets executed. So let's go to the history panel here. We now see that at 1444 the PIM import got executed, and when we go to the products, then we'll see in a minute that also on 1444, that's still running, the products import automatically got started. And when we now refresh data objects tree, then we see that the category category objects got created, and also the product object. In this case, of course, only one, because our XML file now only contains one anymore, as I changed it some minutes ago. This way you can set up pipelines to first import, for example, categories and manufacturers, and afterwards products, and to always guarantee that objects have been created which will afterwards needed for relations or something. And that's starting imports via dependent imports. And at last, I'd like to tell you something about the archive folder. I've skipped that previously, but now getting back to the import to the data port settings, the archive folder, I've already set up this to be imported products, or for example, for the categories, to imported categories. I mean, now to go to this folder, you can also go there via double click. Then we'll see, you can also expand in the tree. Then we'll see that all imports or import files we used for our 3 data ports got saved here in the archive. So the names of those files are generated from the import timestamp. So the first, everything at the start of the file name is the import timestamp, and afterwards this is the generated or the file name of the import file, but of course the slashes of the folders are converted to dashes. So this way you can analyze if, for example, an import goes wrong. Then you can go to the data objects, then check when did the error occur the first time, go to the versions, for example, and there you can see all those times when the object got created. You can compare versions, and then you see when the error occurred, and from that time you can go to your import archive and go to 1444, for example, for the products. And then you'll see that the data port which got executed directly after the timestamp of the version, directly before the timestamp of the version, is this one. And then you can look it up. Then you can say, was there an error in the import data, or was there perhaps an error in the data port configuration, or perhaps there was even an error in some save event handlers or any other application-specific code. So this helps to analyze errors afterwards. Another thing the archive folder is good for is when you access or when you have as the import resource not a local file, but use a URL. For example, when you import some price data, for example, from the European Central Bank, the exchange rates for currencies, then perhaps you want to do a little statistic about how the rates developed over time. But of course you cannot, they provide a URL, but this always only returns the current exchange rates. So when you want to build up an archive, how the exchange rates were yesterday or even before a month, then you can use the import archive as an archive for information which is not retrievable anymore. So then you could build up some kind of archive, and when you later on would need to import those data again, of course you wouldn't be able to fetch those data from the API because this only returns the current exchange rates, but you would have your import archive and could import the data from there. That's what the archive folder is good for. Yes, that's for this session. I've shown all the ways which are currently possible to execute data port imports, and same ways, of course, apply later on for exports, but we'll come to that in another session. And I hope it was useful and you can use that for your own projects. Thanks for listening.
If you got any further questions about mentioned features and configuration options of the Pimcore Data Director, please browse through our YouTube channel. If you do not find answers to your questions there, please feel free to contact our technical support team to hilfe@blackbit.de. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel to remain up to date, and thank you for watching.